Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, February 5, 1944. A converted mansion sits behind barbed wire and armed guards, and inside one of its low-brick outbuildings, a team of engineers stands around a machine that fills an entire room. Valves glow orange in neat banks. Paper tape spools through at a speed that makes the operator's eyes water if they watch too closely. Somewhere in Germany, a message has just been sent from Hitler's high command to a field marshal on the Eastern Front, encrypted on a machine so complex that its designers believed it unbreakable. Within hours, that message will be sitting in plain German on a desk at Bletchley Park, decoded not by a codebreaker with a pencil, but by a machine built from thermionic valves and sheer bloody-minded ingenuity. Nobody in this room calls it a computer. The word barely exists yet. They call it Colossus, and for the next 30 years, its existence will be one of the best-kept secrets in British history. This is not a story that made headlines in 1945. It could not. The men and women who built it, operated it, and used its output to shape the course of the Second World War were bound by the Official Secrets Act to silence so complete that some of them never told their own families what they had done, even as they lay dying decades later. What they built anticipated the architecture of the modern computer by years, and it did so in conditions of total secrecy, using components scavenged and adapted for a purpose nobody had attempted before. This matters because the story of Colossus is not simply the story of a machine. It is the story of how Britain, facing an opponent with seemingly limitless resources, chose to fight with intellect instead, and in doing so, quietly invented the future. To understand why Colossus needed to exist, you have to understand the scale of the problem the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were facing by 1942. Everyone has heard of Enigma, the cipher machine used by the German military for tactical and operational communications, and the extraordinary work of Alan Turing and his colleagues in breaking it. But Enigma was not the most important German cipher system, not by 1942, and not for the purposes that mattered most. As the war progressed, Hitler's high command adopted a far more sophisticated system for their most sensitive strategic communications, the messages passing between Berlin and Army Group commanders across Europe. The Germans called their machine the Lorenz SZ-4-O, and the British, who intercepted its output without initially even knowing what kind of machine produced it, codenamed the resulting cipher Tunny. Where Enigma used 3 or 4 rotors, Tunny used 12, arranged in 2 banks of 5 plus 2 additional wheels controlling irregular movement, generating a key stream of such staggering complexity that the number of possible settings ran into the hundreds of billions. This was not a machine for battlefield orders. This was the cipher carrying communications between Hitler and his generals, discussions of strategy, troop movements, and intentions at the very highest level of the German war machine. If Bletchley Park could read Tunny, they would be reading Hitler's mind. The problem was that nobody at Bletchley had ever seen a Lorenz machine. They had never captured one, never examined its wiring, never held it in their hands. Everything the codebreakers knew about how it worked, they had reconstructed purely from mathematical analysis of intercepted messages, an achievement of pure deduction so remarkable that it stands as one of the great intellectual triumphs of the war, largely credited to a young mathematician named William Tutt, working with limited computational tools, mostly pencil, paper, and extraordinary patience. The breakthrough came in August 1941, when a German operator made a catastrophic error, retransmitting a lengthy message with only minor changes after the original transmission was garbled, using the identical wheel settings both times. That single lapse in discipline gave Bletchley's analysts a rare crack in the system, and from it, over the following months, Tutt and his colleagues worked backwards to deduce the entire logical structure of a machine they had never seen, an achievement one veteran codebreaker later described as akin to reconstructing the complete mechanism of a wristwatch having been told only the sound it made when it ticked. But reconstructing how the machine worked in theory was only the first problem. The second, far larger problem was that even once you understood the logical structure of Tunny, breaking a single message meant testing wheel settings against captured ciphertext in combinations that ran into the billions. Doing this by hand was not merely slow, it was functionally impossible within any time frame that would make the intelligence useful. A message about troop movements decoded 3 months after those troops had already moved was worthless. Worse still, the volume of traffic was growing. As German forces expanded their use of the Lorenz system across multiple army groups and fronts, the number of intercepted messages needing processing multiplied. And every additional link meant more wheel settings to recover, more statistical analysis to perform, more clerks and mathematicians working in shifts around the clock simply to keep pace with a fraction of what was arriving. Bletchley Park had already built one machine to help with this task, an electromechanical device using telephone relays nicknamed Heath Robinson, after the cartoonist famous for drawing absurdly complicated contraptions to perform simple tasks. Heath Robinson worked technically, but it was slow, it was mechanically unreliable, its 2 paper tapes had to run in perfect synchronization at high speed on separate loops, and the machine required near-constant attention from engineers simply to keep the tapes from tearing under the mechanical strain. When a tape did tear, and it happened often, the entire run had to stop while it was painstakingly repaired and resynchronized, costing precious hours the codebreakers did not have. Heath Robinson simply could not process intercepts fast enough to keep pace with the volume of German high command traffic flowing through the airwaves. By late 1942, Bletchley Park faced a genuine crisis. The mathematics of breaking Tunny were understood. The engineering to do it at operational speed did not yet exist anywhere in the world, and without it, the most valuable intelligence of the war risked remaining permanently locked inside indecipherable streams of gibberish. The man who solved this problem was not, on paper, an obvious candidate for one of the most important engineering achievements of the war. Tommy Flowers was a telephone engineer, the son of a bricklayer from London's East End, working at the General Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill in North London. He had spent years developing electronic switching systems for the telephone network, and in the process had become convinced, against the prevailing wisdom of the time, that thermionic valves, the glass vacuum tubes used in radios, could be run reliably in enormous numbers over extended periods, provided they were never switched off and on repeatedly, since it was the thermal stress of powering up that caused most valve failures. This insight ran directly against conventional engineering opinion, which held that a machine using more than a few hundred valves would fail so often as to be useless. Flowers proposed something that sounded, to most people who heard it, faintly insane. He wanted to build a machine using around 1,500 valves, later expanded to around 2,400 in the improved Mark II version, to perform the wheel setting calculations electronically rather than electromechanically. Max Newman, the Cambridge mathematician overseeing the mechanization effort at Bletchley, backed the idea, though many senior figures remained skeptical that a machine of this scale could ever run reliably. Working largely at Dollis Hill with a team of engineers, and drawing on the post office's existing expertise in valve-based switching equipment, Flowers built the first Colossus in 11 months, an almost unbelievable time frame for a machine of this complexity, delivered to Bletchley Park in December 1943 and operational by early the following February. He did much of this at his own financial risk, reportedly investing a portion of his own savings into components when official channels moved too slowly, so convinced was he that the approach would work. Many senior figures in the code-breaking establishment remained doubtful almost until the moment the machine was switched on, and some accounts suggest that had the first Colossus failed, Flowers might well have faced serious professional consequences for having diverted post office resources towards a project several influential voices considered close to fantasy. Colossus worked by reading one of the intercepted, enciphered paper tapes at extraordinarily high speed, up to 5,000 characters per second, the tape itself moving so fast it generated an audible shriek and had to be handled with extreme care to prevent it tearing under the mechanical strain, a sound witnesses later compared to a high-pitched train whistle sustained without pause. Rather than requiring two synchronized tapes as Heath Robinson had, Flowers eliminated the second tape entirely by generating the comparison patterns electronically within the valve circuits themselves, using thyrotron ring counters to simulate the wheel positions of the Lorentz machine. This was the crucial breakthrough. It removed the single greatest source of mechanical failure and allowed the machine to run at a speed no electromechanical system could match. The machine performed Boolean logical operations, comparing the intercepted ciphertext against electronically generated wheel patterns and counting matches, searching for statistical patterns that would reveal the wheel settings the Germans had used for that particular message. Colossus was, in the strictest technical sense, not a general-purpose computer. It could not store a program in the way modern computers do and had to be reconfigured by hand using switches and plug boards for each new task, its logical operation set through a patch panel not unlike an old telephone exchange. But it was programmable. It performed genuinely electronic digital computation using Boolean logic at a speed that dwarfed anything else on Earth, and it did so reliably enough to run continuously for hours. 10 Colossus machines were eventually built and installed at Bletchley Park, each roughly the size of a small room, weighing around a ton, requiring dedicated cooling arrangements to manage the heat thrown off by thousands of valves running continuously, an amount of heat one veteran later compared to standing near a small furnace even in the depths of an English winter. The operators of these machines, many of them members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, worked in shifts around the clock, feeding tapes, monitoring output on electric typewriters, and adjusting the plugboard settings between runs, tasks that demanded intense concentration for hours at a stretch and were carried out by young women who, in most cases, had no idea of the wider significance of what they were doing, sworn as they were to reveal nothing of their work, even to close family. The production of these machines was itself remarkable, moving from a single prototype to a small fleet in well under 2 years, manufactured largely at the Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill under conditions of considerable wartime pressure, with components sourced through channels kept deliberately vague even from many of the workers assembling them, so that no single person outside the senior engineering team held a complete picture of what the finished machine was for. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you might think and costs you nothing. The operational impact of Colossus is difficult to overstate, though much of it remains frustratingly incomplete in the historical record, partly because so many operational logs were destroyed after the war under direct government order. What is documented is that Colossus machines, working alongside the codebreaker's mathematical insight, allowed Bletchley Park to read a substantial proportion of tunny traffic, the high-level strategic communications between Hitler's headquarters and his army group commanders, often within hours or a day of interception, rather than the weeks or months such work would previously have required. Perhaps the most significant documented example came in the run-up to D-Day in June 1944, when decrypted, tunny traffic gave Allied commanders confidence that German High Command believed the main invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy, confirming that the deception operation known as Fortitude was working. This intelligence, filtered through to commanders under the code word Ultra, without ever revealing its true source, shaped decisions at the very highest levels of Allied planning. General Dwight Eisenhower later described intelligence of this kind as having been decisive to the Allied victory, though he was careful, as everyone connected to the program was for decades afterwards, never to specify precisely which source he meant. Exact numbers of lives saved or shortened duration of the war remain, by their nature, impossible to calculate with precision, and historians remain understandably cautious about attaching specific figures to such claims. Some estimates, offered cautiously by historians studying the program after declassification, have suggested the war in Europe may have been shortened by a period measured in years rather than months as a result of ultra-intelligence as a whole, of which tunny decrypts formed a critical strategic component, though such figures remain the subject of ongoing historical debate rather than settled fact. What can be said with more confidence is that the psychological value to Allied commanders of knowing, with reasonable confidence, what their opponent believed and intended was immense, an advantage that money alone could not have purchased and that no other combatant nation possessed to the same degree. Set against the German and American efforts of the same period, the scale of what Flowers and his team achieved becomes clearer still. Germany never developed anything resembling Colossus during the war. Konrad Zuse, working largely in isolation and with minimal state support, built electromechanical relay-based computers, the Z3 among them, remarkable achievements in their own right but built on relay technology, orders of magnitude slower than Colossus's electronic valve circuits, and never applied to code-breaking at anything like Bletchley's scale or urgency. German cryptographic authorities, extraordinarily, remained convinced throughout the war that Lorenzen-ciphered traffic was essentially unbreakable, a confidence that proved catastrophically misplaced. The Americans, meanwhile, were formidable codebreakers in their own right, particularly against Japanese naval codes in the Pacific, but their major programmable electronic computer, ENIAC, was not completed until 1945, after the war in Europe had ended, and was designed primarily for ballistics calculations rather than cryptanalysis. Colossus, operational from February 1944, predates ENIAC by well over a year, and its use of Boolean logic gates implemented in valve circuitry represents an approach later echoed in the fundamental architecture of electronic computing generally. Britain, in short, built the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer in near-total secrecy, used it to help win a war, and then told almost nobody for a generation. The legacy of Colossus is complicated precisely because of that secrecy. Winston Churchill personally ordered the destruction of most Colossus machines after the war, and the surviving units, along with all detailed technical drawings, were kept classified for decades. Tommy Flowers, the man whose insight and engineering skill had made the entire project possible, was ordered to destroy his own blueprints and was legally barred from discussing his work, even as computing pioneers in America received public credit and academic recognition for achievements that, in some respects, followed the path Flowers had already quietly walked years earlier. He received a modest financial payment from the government after the war, but nothing approaching recognition proportional to what he had accomplished, and he spent decades unable to correct a historical record that simply omitted him. It was not until the 1970s, following the declassification of ultra-intelligence more broadly, that the story of Colossus began to reach the public, and not until the 1990s and 2000s that the full scale of the achievement was properly appreciated, aided considerably by a painstaking reconstruction project at the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, where a working rebuilt Colossus, based on surviving fragments, photographs, and the memories of veteran engineers, can be seen operating today. Valves glowing, tape shrieking through at speed, a direct physical link to a machine most of the world spent 30 years not knowing had ever existed. Return, for a moment, to that room in February 1944, the valves glowing, the tape screaming through the reader, the operators watching decrypted German plans emerge from a machine nobody outside a small circle was permitted to acknowledge. What happened in that room, and in the rooms like it that followed, changed the shape of the war and changed the shape of the world that came after it, though almost nobody would know it for a generation. A machine built by a telephone engineer from the East End of London, dismissed by some as an impossible gamble on temperamental glass valves, ran for months on end with a reliability nobody had believed achievable, and in doing so, quietly crossed a threshold that would later be called the birth of the electronic computer age. It did not announce itself. It could not. Secrecy was the price of its usefulness, and Britain paid that price in full, accepting that the men and women who had built the future would have to watch others receive the credit for reaching it. Tommy Flowers died in 1998, having lived to see at least some acknowledgement of what he had achieved, though never the full measure of it. Colossus was not the birth of the computer as popular memory often tells it, borrowed instead from American post-war machines built in the open, celebrated in newspapers, remembered in the standard histories. It was something quieter and, in its way, more remarkable still. Proof that a nation under existential threat, facing an enemy that believed its ciphers unbreakable, could answer not with more force, but with more intelligence, built in secret, run in silence, and hidden from the world for 30 years. The valves have long since cooled. The men who built and ran Colossus are almost all gone now. But in a converted hut at Bletchley Park, a rebuilt Colossus still runs, tape still shrieking through its speed, valves still glowing orange in the dark, a machine that helped win a war and then simply disappeared from history, until history finally caught up with what it had done.